Hello, and welcome to the Slate Political Gabfest for September 17th, 2020, the Giant Fires Everywhere edition. I am David Plotz in Washington, D.C. I am joined from New Haven, Connecticut, from her home, by Emily Bazelon of the New York Times Magazine and Yale University Law School. Hello, Emily.
Hey, David. Hey, Jamelle. Hey, John.
That was too soon. You couldn't tell. They haven't been introduced yet. People don't even know
I
they're
know,
there.
but I'm looking at
We
their
don't
smiling
exist
faces.
until we're introduced.
I stepped on the introduction. Continue.
Also joining us, of course, is John Dickerson of CBS's 60 Minutes from New York. Hello, John.
Hello, David. Hello, Jamelle. Hello, Emily.
And joining us for the whole show today, thank goodness, is the New York Times columnist, I should say. New York Times columnist Jamelle Bouie from Charlottesville. Hello, Jamelle.
Hello there. I'm not going to go through this round of hellos.
Yes, this ridiculousness. We are live. We're live today. We're live on YouTube and Facebook. I like to call it Facebook. It would be better if it was Facebook. We backed it away. Facebook here on Wednesday evening as part of the Texas Tribune's virtual festival. We always love being with the Texas Tribune. We were in Austin last year, I think, for this. Certainly, we've been in Austin for this show. Maybe 2 years ago. And I cannot, I think it was last year. Yeah, everything, time, the kind of dilation and compression of time, craziness. I, for one, cannot wait to get back to Austin post-pandemic. Before we get started, we want your questions, listeners. Please drop them in the comment section wherever you are. We will answer the questions that we can. So put them in the comment section, either on YouTube or Facebook or wherever you're watching us, and we will answer anything we can. On today's Gabfest, the forest fires that are scorching the West, polluting the air, the climate crisis is here. Are we remotely capable of tackling it? Then a top Trump official accuses government scientists of sedition and warns of an armed insurrection by the left to steal the election from Trump. Can the American system survive when a significant minority of Americans no longer believe in the legitimacy of politics and elections or the legitimacy of their political opponents? And how is that going to play out during this campaign? And then the pandemic has a renewed interest in different kinds of work arrangements and work schedules. So should we work less, or more specifically, should we work a 4-day week, those of us who work 5-day weeks? Plus, we will, of course, have cocktail chatter. Fires have now burned more than 5 million acres of the West this fire season, an area the size of Emily's dear state of Connecticut. And while there may be some relief coming in Oregon and Washington, California in particular remains dry and scorching, and we are only in the middle of fire season. Smoke has made the air throughout the West some of the most dangerous air in the world to breathe, and has even made the sky eerie here on the East Coast. I don't know if you guys saw this in DC where I was. The sunrise yesterday was spooky. It was absolutely spooky. And meanwhile, we have a Hurricane Sally, which is dropping essentially infinite amounts of water on the Gulf Coast, an irony that is not lost on anyone. There's historic and catastrophic flooding, according to the National Weather Service. So, Emily, when we think about the fires in particular, this is a series of man-made tragedies, an agglomeration of man-made tragedies. There's not one single thing, right?
Right. There is climate change, the heating of the earth. It's not a coincidence that these fires are happening right after a record heat wave on the West Coast. But then you also have these decisions to build in the wildland-urban interface, a phrase I had not heard until last week, the WUI, but to extend housing out into these areas that have all these combustible timber where it's more dangerous fire-wise for people to live, but it's also affordable in a way that cities like San Francisco are not. So you have these combination of human choices. And I think a just real failure of our political system to grapple with this and do anything to change the incentives. And then these just monumental scorchings of the earth. I mean, I'm sure that people listening and watching have seen the pictures and the images, but I was struck by this statistic that the Bear Fire is ravaging more or as much as all of the fires of 2019. And that's just one of the many huge fires that are happening right now. So we're just seeing this colossal scale that that feels like it's portends more to come in future years.
Six, just to add one quick fact to add to Emily, 6 of California's 10 largest wildfires have happened since 2018, and 5 of them have happened this year.
So, Jamelle, Biden called Trump a climate arsonist, while Trump and the conservative media have focused on this line. They blamed it solely on these fire suppression policies. These now retrospectively apparently super misguided fire suppression policies, which have allowed huge amounts of kindling effectively to build up throughout California, rather than allowing a lot of stuff to burn regularly as it used to before we stopped it. Do you think this is is this a fundamentally political issue, or is this something that we can get out of politics at all?
I mean, I think it's a fundamental political issue in that it is an issue that deals, as you kind of alluded to, very intimately with habitation patterns, the kinds of communities we're building, the kind of state California has built for itself, or Oregon, or wherever the wildfires are reaching. And so I'm not sure you could take it out of politics. I do think that kind of the key mitigation strategies California could take the issues don't necessarily fall along kind of left, right, Republican, Democratic, traditional partisan lines. So, right, part of the problem here is that human habitation has moved into these areas close to wilderness where, for example, a gender reveal party gone wrong can spark a massive fire. And the reason we're building homes out there is because it's too expensive on the coast. And the reason it's too expensive it's on the coast is because it's illegal to build additional housing on the coast effectively. You can't really densify by law large swaths of San Francisco or San Diego or any other coastal town. Now, the political coalition of people who want to densify coastal California comprises mostly liberals. The political coalition of people who are opposed to densifying coastal California also comprises mostly liberals, right? It's a very contentious political issue, but it isn't necessarily a left-right issue. And what's interesting is that, President Trump, since last month, roughly maybe 2 months ago, has been kind of running against dense housing in the suburbs, associating it with crime and all sorts of things. And this is sort of like the first time this has come up to the level of national politics. And to the extent that, there are ways to pursue solutions, Trump coming out against dense housing might be the best thing that could happen for people who want to densify coastal California, because it suddenly makes opposition to densifying coastal California kind of a pro-Trump issue. It's a weird way it's interacting on like political on local politics. But I think my main point is that this isn't outside of big climate policy, which has an effect down the line but doesn't have an immediate effect. The stuff you could do now it's not really partisan, but that doesn't mean it's not political.
But that's a great point. I mean, because the fight is like a NIMBY-YIMBY fight, right? Not in my backyard. Right. Yes, in my backyard, being fought presumably among Democrats who make up the majority in California, but maybe Trump has succeeded in polarizing it in a way that could affect some of the NIMBY folks to move away from him.
Although my suspicion is that the people who are living, my suspicion is that the people who are living on the what's your term, Emily? The Maui, the Maui?
The wildland urban.
Living in the Maui actually are not liberals who would otherwise be living in condos in San Francisco. I suspect it's probably like the people who live in rural America and exurban America are conservative people. So it is true that the liberals are fighting over building in San Francisco, but that's not the same as saying that it is liberals who are being driven out to the WUI. It is probably conservatives in the WUI. That would be my posit. John, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, the other political angle is the National Climate Assessment in 2000 predicted that this would happen, that the risk of fires as a result of global warming would increase. And as I understand it, So that's back in 2000. Then the president's national climate assessment in 2017 and 2018 predicted the same thing. And as I understand it, it's not just climate doesn't just mean there's going to be more fires, but they are going to be of a different kind that are harder to fight, where you get these towers of fire, and you get the winds that create intense blazes that what are they called? Pyrocumulus clouds, which in turn create these lightning storms that we've had, which means and fire tornadoes. I mean, that's the result of climate change, which obviously is a highly political issue.
But so, John, one of the things that I think is so weird about this is that because these fires are happening in states that are not at issue in the presidential election, this president does not give a damn about them. There's no interest in. If you know that if these fires were happening in Wisconsin right now, there would be $500 billion worth of fire relief that was going in. The president would be flying Air Force One and dropping retardant from Air Force One. So, I mean, that's just an observation. It seems like that's a tragedy of the American political system right now.
Well, you saw on Tuesday evening in the ABC town hall that the president talked about sort of Democrat states, as he called them, and George Stephanopoulos said, "Well, don't you represent the entire country?" And he ultimately said, "Well, yes, I'm the president of the entire country." But it was clear in that instance, and it's been clear since the first tax cut was talked about internally in the Trump White House as one that would punish blue states and reward red states, that his mindset, and we certainly saw this with in terms of hurricanes when they hit Texas and Florida, his reaction was noticeably different than when it hits Puerto Rico. That the asymmetry of concern from the president has been a thorough line from his presidency. He is concerned about the things that are in his interest and not so much in the other. And so I think, and this obviously is another. I mean, the parallels to the response to COVID when he was in that briefing and said basically the fires will go away. It's going to get cooler. I thought somebody was joking when they quoted that, because it was so similar to the response he had given at least 32 times during the rise of COVID that it's just going to go away.
Well, he also said today, did you guys see that he said, basically speaking, I mean, just in the comparison, he said, well, if you discount the deaths in blue states, we're doing pretty well, when he was talking about COVID. I mean, he really thinks about every issue in this way, in a way that's so poisonous for the country.
I mean, the other thing about the Trump moment at the press conference in California was, again, dismissing the idea that science points to climate change as this important cause. And I mean, obviously, we've seen Trump be very denying of scientific consensus in the coronavirus story all spring. And we've heard him say it again about climate change, but it just throws into sharp relief this contrast between the Republican stance, at least of the president, and Democrats. And I was interested to read some Republican pollsters saying, you know what, like, we've moved beyond this as reality at the moment. I mean, what we're seeing is so clearly informed by climate change. The way that insurance companies are going to respond to this, planning for the future, by cities and states, by the military, is so informed by the reality of warming, that to have Trump continuing to claim that, the scientists don't really know, it just really stands out.
But it stands out, Jamelle, but is it in any sense politically bad for him? I mean, you would like right now there's a hurricane that is flooding Alabama. Like, it's an enormous hurricane at Florida, Alabama, Georgia. I mean, Georgia and Florida, those are states that matter. I mean, it's a huge hurricane, and yet this climate is not top of mind for anybody.
No, I find it strange. I was just about to mention the hurricane in relation to the Gulf Coast states, because Alabama has a coast on part of Alabama's on the coast, Georgia, Florida. These are red states or states with Republican governments that rely greatly on tourist dollars, that rely on their coastal regions as economic engines. And so you'd think that strictly from we want to keep the state in the best fiscal shape as possible, you would think that there would be this concern with climate change, with its implications for, coastal Alabama, which could be destroyed by climate disaster, kind of crippling the state's economy. And so I don't, I can't really not gonna psychologize. I can't get into the mindset of, of these political leaders, but just as an observer, setting aside ideology, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me that one would discard this. I mean, one, to the extent that it does make sense, it's only if denial of climate change has become part of like the package of beliefs that signify Republican identity.
Yes, it has.
And so, so if it now to be Republican means I also do not believe in climate change, then you just have to, the challenge is to find some way to like uncouple those beliefs. I mean, part of me, to go to the Trump dismissing fires in California because it's a blue state or whatever, part of me wonders if all of this, not all of it, but if some of it is kind of an effect of just the Electoral College, that like, if you don't have a political incentive to try to, win over climate change concerned Republicans in California or in New York for that matter, then you're not going to. And although I'm sort of a long time, crusader against the Electoral College, also just on a practical level, it seems like it would be healthier for the country's politics if national politicians had to assemble, coalitions based off of shared interests rather than just, what state people happen to be in. And that might mean Republican candidates campaigning for, again, the large number of voters, Republican voters, in states that are sort of dramatically affected by climate change.
Emily.
Yeah, that's such a good point, right? Because if you think of all of those sort of wasted Republican votes, some of those people might be less devoted to the climate change as a hoax, kind of Fox News viewing wing of the party, right? Because I mean, we saw Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity back Trump up on the skepticism that climate change is causing the fires. You could imagine that Republicans who live in these affected areas are less prone to be in that camp.
Emily, there's a question from Hondo, one of our listeners. It's a really good question. With regard to the fires, could you discuss the intersection between climate justice and social justice? So I think one of the points is that the people disproportionately affected by climate are also people who are poorer and tend to be people of color.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's true. First of all, globally, when we look at where parts of the earth are warming, who is going to have to move. There's an amazing feature in My Home, the New York Times Magazine this week about the amount of the percentage of the globe that is uninhabitable because of temperatures rising is currently 1%, is going to grow to almost 20%. And so when you look at that force, it's true. And then, there also are these maps showing that people who live in cities in areas that used to be redlined, there are fewer trees, they're more affected. And then obviously if you have to move and your housing is unsettled because of the fires, if you have fewer resources, that's a heavier burden to bear. I wonder if we're seeing enough activism around this in a way to try to entice young people to the polls. I mean, this is climate. Young voters rank climate as a higher concern than older voters. They kind of get it. It's their world. They're going to inherit. And I wonder if we're just seeing enough urgency about that because historically, people in their 20s and late teens don't vote at high rates. And so you would think that this could be galvanizing, but we'll have to see if that actually translates because people always say that there's going to be some reason that young people come to the polls in greater numbers, and then that tends to be disappointing.
John, do you think, just to follow up on that question of Emily, which is that that report in the Times is amazing. I mean, I think to put some flesh on it, Emily, it's 1 billion people are living in places that are about to become in our lifetimes, basically, in Jamelle's lifetime anyway, because he's so young, literally uninhabitable. That literally people will not be able to live there. Human beings cannot live there and be outside. I mean, I suppose we could build, turtle cities there, underground cities there. That's 1 billion people who have to go somewhere. So is there anything that you see, John, in our policies, in our debates, in anything that's happening in the world that makes you think, oh, we are going to be able to accommodate this? Because it's just a fact. It is a fact that it's going to happen. Things are going to burn. People are going to die or move.
Yes, and also just if you want to pull the shades all the way down and make it just completely dark, scientists say that the carbon dioxide that's already trapped in the Earth's atmosphere has now passed the point where we can avert the worst effects of global warming. So even if there was a full-throated effect to address the issue, we still have further pounding to take. And you talk about those 1 billion people. This is why increasingly, certainly during the Obama years, but even now when you talk to national security experts, remember Bernie Sanders was mocked when he said this in 2016, but that climate change is a national security threat because those 1 billion destabilize other countries. Those 1 billion end up causing problems for the United States. And so it's not just what may happen domestically, but it's the knock-on effects of that kind of destabilization all across the globe. Do I think there's a solution? Well, I mean, we are in the high age of short-term thinking, and something has to break us out of that. And I don't, it can be a president, but it used to be that the presidents didn't, you would hope that this would reside in a functioning Congress because the members of Congress are around longer. The members of Congress have a different set of, at least in the way it was supposed to be designed, should have different sets of incentives that make them longer term thinkers than a president who's trying to get through just 4 years and then get reelected. So I don't see, but of course that Congress doesn't work that way anymore. So I don't see a collective action, process for handling this when we have failed on so many other things that require something more than short-term thinking.
All right. Slate Plus members get bonus segments on the Gabfest and other Slate podcasts. And you can go to slate.com/Gabfest Plus to become a member today. It's just $35 for your first year. You will be supporting the great journalism that Slate does and supporting some of the work that we do. And it allows us to do extra segments on the Gabfest, which is really fun for us. Today's Slate Plus segment is going to be questions. We're going to do a Q&A with the audience here on this live stream. So please go to slate.com/Gabfest Plus, and if you are so inclined, become a member today. The potential for violence and for a catastrophic, disastrous outcome of the presidential election is very, 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 very high. Both the left and the right are viewing this election in what Tom Edsall today in the Times called apocalyptic terms. The Republican Party has been conditioning its voters to mistrust elections. Democratic voters are just very angry at the preposterous electoral college system, which causes the votes of millions and millions of people to effectively not matter. An increasing number of Americans, mostly concentrated on the right, simply just don't believe in the legitimacy of electoral politics or of their opposition party. And each side is accusing the other of plotting a violent coup. This week, a leading Trump official, Michael Caputo, said that out loud. He said, quote, "And when Donald Trump refuses to stand down at the inauguration, the shooting will begin. The drills you've seen are nothing. If you carry guns, buy ammunition, ladies and gentlemen, because it's going to be hard to get." Caputo just took a medical leave because his remarks were so controversial. But Jamelle, as you wrote this week, like Caputo may have been sidelined, but he reflects a very powerful stream of thought on the right and to a lesser extent on the left.
Yeah, it's I don't really know what to say about all of this. It's bad. It's
not actually funny, and yet what choice do we have other than to laugh a little bit?
I mean, the principal problem, right? I mean, sort of the marquee problem is that the president himself has sort of made this delegitimization of the election process kind of central to his message. He's constantly saying, if I don't win, it's rigged, that you can't trust mail-in voting, that, you know, they're gonna, and the Attorney General Bill Barr, I believe, echoed this today or yesterday, you know, they're gonna have warehouses full of ballots that they're just gonna ship in, and it's all gonna be a fraud. And so that's sort of the steady drumbeat. And there's not really any resistance to it among kind of mainstream conservative outlets. You don't hear resistance to this on Fox News. You don't hear resistance to this on conservative talk radio. It's either ignored or affirmed. And so you have the president with this message. You have it being ignored or affirmed by conservative media and, you know, many Republican politicians. And naturally, Republican voters are extremely mistrustful of the process. On the other side, the very fact that the president appears very interested in dismissing or invalidating as many ballots as he can has fueled a lot of fear and distrust on the left, and this is added to the fact that right now, if the margin in the election shrinks to Biden is up 3 or 4 points, that's effectively a coin toss for the Electoral College. And so you have this situation where liberals and Democrats and just Trump opponents recognize that their margin of error is actually pretty narrow here, that they could win more votes, and by a considerable number of more votes. A 3.5 point margin, for example, would be millions of votes, and it doesn't necessarily guarantee an Electoral College win. And they see this, and they also see the president and the attorney general attack mail-in voting. They see Republican legislatures in states like Wisconsin take steps to make it more difficult for voters to receive ballots in the midst of a pandemic. They see Republican judges and justices on the federal courts do the same, and I think they're rightfully paranoid of what may happen. And then, assuming the election goes off and happens smoothly or even like semi-smoothly, there's sort of a belief, and I don't think an unjustified belief, that the president is going to, if on election night there are still a lot of ballots to be counted, but he appears to be ahead because of his voters are more likely to vote in person, there's a real fear he'll just declare victory and attempt to stop counting however way he can. And so that's the situation. And unfortunately, the only way you could resolve it is if the president stopped talking the way he's talking, right? If President Trump just stopped doing this and, could embrace boilerplate about having free and fair elections and everybody's voice and vote being able to count, then this would turn down the temperature considerably. But because he's not, we're going to go into November completely on edge and with a real fear of violence and unrest. Because, of course, if Biden wins or Biden leads on November 3rd, there are going to be people following the president's lead who say, well, this was illegitimate. There must have been warehouses full of ballots marked Biden.
So, Emily, this Edsel column surveyed political scientists, and essentially every single political scientist surveyed cited a massive risk of electoral violence, both in the buildup and mostly in the aftermath of the election. I mean, this is sort of making Bush v. Gore look like a Cabbage Patch picnic. What is to be done?
Yeah, I mean, I keep thinking back to 2000. We did not have a buildup before the 2000 election that was a polarizing fight over methods of voting. which is what we're having now, right? So Trump is delegitimizing voting by mail because more Democrats than Republicans say that's how they're planning to vote. And that's creating these images of, warehouses and uncounted ballots and these vastly exaggerated false claims of fraud. And so to counter that, I think Democrats are pointing at the president and saying that he's creating this atmosphere of fear and sowing distrust. And that could be a reason to doubt the results for Democrats, because maybe there'll be some voter suppression. Maybe the power will go out in a Democratic stronghold city and people won't be able to vote. I mean, there are things that could go wrong that could be massive voter suppression. What do you do about that? What has to happen in the voting process? How well does it have to go? What's the standard for how people get to vote that crosses our threshold for a fair and legitimate election? There are always mistakes in elections. There are always people whose votes get thrown out. Things do not go perfectly. And we have put up with, some play in the joints because we've had basic buy-in from both parties about the whole system. One of the things I keep thinking about...
Did you say play in the joist? That was
I love that.
A great metaphor. Did you coin that?
No, play in the joints. That's not like a normal thing that people say.
I don't know. It was just like good to have it at your...
Glad to hear that.
I thought you said joints. I thought you said joist, not joints.
Oh, I meant joints.
You can play in the joist or play in the joints. Either way.
Right.
So, all right, now that we've totally...
Liability. Yeah, and so then the other thing about Bush versus Gore is that Gore conceded, right? All the votes weren't counted, but the Supreme Court ordered the Florida counting process to stop. And Gore said, okay. And a lot of Democrats criticized him at the time, but it meant the country didn't go through this seizure over who had been legitimately elected president. I mean, there was still a lot of naysaying and doubting about George W. Bush, but it was not shared. Like, if there's a big question this time, there's going to be pressure on Biden not to concede, depending on what happens. And that's scary, too. And there's a way in which, one more thing, one of the best ways to spread misinformation and propaganda is to accuse the other side of lying and false claims. And we see that all the time, right? I mean, that's what the phrase fake news is about. It's all about turning the tables and no, it's you, not me. And I just feel like that's another part of this that makes it really hard to sort out, that both sides are going to claim that the other side is lying.
Shall I just jump in, David?
Yeah.
Okay. So a couple of things. I think the one trying to find hope in this scenario, because I think obviously we've sketched out the darkest and highly realistic case because of what the one of the chief actors, if not the chief actor in this, the president has done. It was extraordinary to listen to Frank LaRose on 538, his interview. He's the Secretary of State of Ohio, who is controversial because he limited the number of drop-off spots for ballots. But in his conversation, talking about basically how anybody who sows doubt about the American electoral system, and particularly the 2020 campaign, is doing Russia's work for it. Now, he didn't say the president's name, but I mean, it was basically saying that the exact argument that the president has given and Bob and Bill Barr has given is essentially sowing exactly the kind of mistrust and doubt about the American system that the Russians and America's enemies want, which is, and so you do have some secretaries of state, and we'll see how they behave when it comes down to it. But some Republican secretaries of state who have local pressures to perhaps do the right thing. So that might be come into effect and into play. And the other thing that might be a place of hope is Florida starts counting their ballots 22 days before election night. Florida has some, if you're talking about Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, they're going to be a mess, and they're a mess up to election day. Like, they're not going to be able to handle the increase in mail-in ballots, and they seem to be thwarting all the efforts to try to get up to speed beforehand, or it seems that way. I'm sort of overstating it, but Arizona and Florida seem to have a much better system, and so you could imagine, if you were trying to imagine an optimistic scenario, is that on election night, if this is the optimistic no violence scenario, that basically that Florida comes in early, and obviously Florida has been a consistently problematic state, to use a word I don't like, and Arizona had a problem with its 2018 results as well. So again, this is just, I'm trying to be optimistic here, but that Florida, because of the early counting, can actually have a solid result early. That it might, and Arizona, which would be later in the night, is another battleground state that has experience with counting these kinds of votes early. That you could have a situation where the number of votes and the electoral votes is too big for the president to complain over. Now, obviously, there are lots of other ways it can go. But if Florida ends up
tight in Florida, right? I mean, that puts a lot of weight. We always care about Florida, but that means we care extra about Florida because they count their votes fast, as opposed to like they're a swing state like all the others.
Right. I mean, look, Florida could be, there are all kinds of things that could go wrong. I'm just saying if in fact it's close in Florida, if Florida if we're taking a look at the scenarios of whether the president would not give up power, Florida could tell us early in the night where things are going, because Florida's system at least has some possibility that it can weather the size of the new mail-in ballots.
I wonder if
and sort of there aren't very many avenues in which the president loses Florida and then goes on to win the Electoral College. It kind of is the linchpin of his re-election victory. So if at 9 p.m. on election night, Biden wins Florida, you can't necessarily say that's the ball game, but it kind of is the ball game. It would be in 2008. I think the first state that was called was Indiana for Obama. And it's sort of like, oh yeah, if Obama's winning Indiana, then the election is over and we know who won. And now it's just waiting to see how this plays out. And Florida, to a lesser extent, plays kind of the same role for the president's re-election campaign.
So
that is a totally fair point. I just have to say, though, that there's something disturbing about this notion that now we're putting so much weight on the state's process for counting ballots, and the fact that Florida does it faster, because the votes in the rest of the country matter just as much, right? I mean, we're essentially penalizing other swing states because they don't have their acts together to count the ballots faster. And, in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, there's been no legislative movement that I know of to open the envelopes earlier and get going. In Michigan, the Senate in Michigan actually just passed a bill that would allow election officials to open the ballots and kind of get ready to go. I think it's 20 hours before Election Day or something. And the Michigan House is expected to pass that bill. So there's a little window there. But I just want to, again, it's the process of counting, the pace of counting is taking on this huge weight, and that's because we're all not buying in, but we're accepting the premise that it's got to be. It would be much better if it was resolved sooner, and I totally see it and I share it. But we also have to prepare for the fact that we may not know, and that may be because the ballots are being legitimately counted and processed.
So, what is it that the media can do, Jamelle? The media, being a broad swath of people, to try to tamp down the risk of danger. I think that if there is ambiguity, it's going to be terribly dangerous for everyone. But shouldn't the media promote ambiguity?
No, I think that if not promote ambiguity, I think the media should be clear and loud and consistent with viewers that elections are never actually decided on election night. Not really. Ballots always take time to count. That what you see on election night are always projections, and normally the projections are on target. But in a presidential election, the electors don't actually meet for some time after the election, and so I think what viewers and readers and web surfers and everyone has to understand is that it will take time to count ballots. This is not evidence of malintent or shenanigans. It is simply how the process always plays out, and it's being played out that way, sort of for understandable reasons over maybe a longer time horizon this time. and that people should not expect results on election night. That really we're looking at an election week. We're looking at an election fortnight. But you're not going to get it on election
is that
night.
Where we all kill each other? Election fortnight
exactly.
is we all kill each other and one person survives.
But also on that same point, at the New York Times, on our sort of election results pages, in a lot of places for the longest time they had precincts remaining, which is sort of misleading, right? Because precincts does not tell you how many votes are likely to be out there. So doing something as simple as changing, and this is what the Times has done, I know this has generally made its way through, changing it to votes that have been received, right, helps get readers in the mindset of understanding, there's still a lot more votes out there, and so we just have to wait for them to be counted and collected.
I think it's like if we're covering the World Series, I think, and this is true of television, which hopefully will announce.
Never.
If you're covering the World Series, every ball or strike you don't announce with breathless excitement as if it's going to lead to the final determination of the series.
And you don't say that whoever's ahead in the third inning is going to win.
Well, that's right. Or let's just torque this analogy even further. Whoever gets the first hit in the first inning is going to win. I mean, when you call Massachusetts for the Democrat, you should basically do it, like in a passing tone. It is not leading to some ultimate, great revelation at the end of the night. It is some interesting information we get along the way. We look at some stuff that might be trending in various interesting states that are interesting, but we got like 7 games to play. And, it is a game that is often decided, or series are sometimes decided in the last play of the last game. But
have the networks, CNN, Fox, and the networks, have they learned, and are they going to be able to exercise restraint? Because it's awfully hard when that bowl of candy that is calling Ohio, that is calling Florida, is out there, to not take that piece of candy. So,
hey man, I am stacking up the wet blankets, and I am going to be throwing them everywhere I can. I think people
throwing them around your own network and the other ones too.
No, I know. I know the people. Particularly Anthony Salvanto, who is the surveys and elections director at CBS, is a serious guy and knows this in his bones, and everybody trusts him and puts a lot of faith in him. So hopefully we won't, those of us who are in front of the camera, and hopefully I won't, succumb to the moment, and we'll be, we'll treat it like a World Series and not like, a death match.
All right, Emily,
looking back. All
right, Jamelle, you can say one quick thing, but then I want the last question to Emily.
Just looking back at the primaries, I thought networks did a pretty good job of communicating to viewers that things are going to take time to count and that you're not going to know results immediately. Although
that Iowa caucus, and we've all forgotten because of the pandemic, that was such a rat fuck. It was such an unbelievable rat fuck that was humiliating. I mean, it did make you think, why should I trust this whole process? Look at this ridiculous thing in high school gyms. Who the hell knows what's going on here? And they can't even report results. So you can understand.
That was Iowa's issue.
Yes.
And the Democratic Party, it was the primary. It was privately run. It wasn't even the state, right?
All right, Emily, last question on this, which comes from a listener from Adam Bassi. What is the greatest risk to a fair election that is not being talked about enough?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Lasers. Been looking a lot. What's that?
John? Lasers.
Meteor strike. I feel, let's see. I mean, I hate entertaining these really. So I guess one thing is I think we're starting to understand that when we talk about disinformation, the threat is just as much a domestic one as it is one that comes from abroad. In 2020, there was just an amazing story in the Washington Post about a troll farm run out of Phoenix, Arizona, which is definitely part of the United States, by Turning Point Action, a conservative outfit that recruits young people, and they were, creating fake Twitter profiles, doing the whole thing to pass around tweets and Instagram posts, doubting coronavirus death count, doubting the legitimacy of mail-in balloting. It was like Trump talking points spread by this outfit. And that kind of shift where disinformation comes from within, that's a formidable challenge. We don't really have laws or rules that adequately address it. I'm not sure it quite reaches the level of Adam's idea of calling for something that nobody's thought of yet, but it's definitely on my mind.
All right, let's go to something just like mildly more cheerful, which is the pandemic. So the pandemic.
No, this is about the world as much after the pandemic.
I know. I'm just being ironic. The pandemic has changed how basically almost everyone works. So remotely for many people, shielded, more outdoors, with fewer people, at home, less, not working because unemployed, working in a bubble, working more dangerously. And I think what it's done is that it's also made people start to think, are the ways that we work in this world normal? Do they make sense? I think sometimes it takes a huge upheaval to change in a moment something that has existed because no one's asked the question about it for generations. And we are certainly in that case. The pandemic is going to do that to all kinds of things. And so one of the things that it's doing too is how much we work. And John, I would start with this, which is that the 7-day week is artificial. It does not correspond. I mean, it's been part of most human societies for several thousand years, but there's no reason that there's a 7-day week. And the concept of the weekend is incredibly new. Like there used to be a 1 day, most people had a sort of 1 day off for work for religious reasons starting last couple thousand years. But the idea of a weekend that's a 2-day weekend is very, very, very new. And the word weekend itself doesn't even appear in English till 1879. So, like, should we start with the premise that there is no calendar, time has no meaning, and we should just do what we want?
Well, obviously, time. I mean, right, but we're never going to get there. I wonder if any of you have felt a loosening in the joints, as some like to put it, in your own life. Without the signifiers of, I mean, also I'm a get dressed and go to work kind of person, like I have a very regimented life. And so since that's gone, I've noticed some ability to kind of float more easily between work and not work. Because also we have weird jobs where you work 7 days a week anyway, because you're writing always in your head or you're writing, whenever you need to. But I guess what I'm wondering is whether people, the idea of working from home kind of was always like, it was always you were working from home. And so I'm wondering whether we've developed new ways of thinking that allow us to shift more easily. And so if it's not 4 days a week, in a row, maybe there is a way in which we've become more comfortable with working and sliding in and out of work that would be more healthy. Because at first, during the pandemic, I was working more because it was just always right in front of me. So I guess I don't go all the way to the 4 day week, but I'm trying to put my finger on there is some shift, and what is it? And can we keep it once this, in the middle of next year, or once the vaccine is widely available and people are actually going back to their offices?
Well, I think what's been revealed is
that's what I'm looking for.
What's been revealed is that so much of what was in the inherent structure of the 9 to 5 work. I mean, like, let's posit that lots of people have jobs where you have to be. If you were a security guard who was guarding something, it can't be like, not going to guard it for this hour. I'm going to surf the internet. Like there are lots of people who have jobs where the physical presence and the kind of attention are absolute requirements of the job. And we happen to have jobs that are not that way. We happen to have jobs where you can like float in and out and not pay too much attention. But like for like the significant percent of Americans who work in kind of the information economy and were physically present in work sites, like you realize how much bullshit time there was. Like how much time, I mean, Jamelle and Emily, you probably don't even recognize this because you both fled the offices. But as somebody was often in an office, it's like all the time you just spend bullshitting, which is really important. But maybe we can just now get rid of it. Maybe it can now go to taking care of Jamelle's incredibly cute child.
Yeah, I don't think that that's going to go away. I, in fact, think that it's going to come back, and that what's going to happen is that people are going to find ways to try to recreate something like that, even if they're not going into offices all the time. Because that sort of physical proximity in that sense is actually kind of important to... Yeah.
So I just want to note, I love being in offices.
Yeah,
I love physical proximity. Anyway, you guys have all worked in an office with me, and I'm just like constantly irritating and bothering. I love it. So I agree. I hope you're right.
And I mean, the other thing is that, right, so like downtown DC sort of is dependent on office workers. Like that's what drives the economy of downtown DC. If there are no office workers in downtown DC, there's not really any reason to be in downtown DC. And that's true of a lot of places. There are a lot of cities whose downtown districts, the restaurants, the convenience stores, everything there survive because of office workers. And so there's this, we're likely to see an economic hit in that regards. And I sort of wonder if, as people, try to get space by moving to suburbs, by moving to smaller cities and so on, if they're going to try to recreate basically those patterns of habitation and, the kinds of businesses in larger cities on a smaller scale, because they do offer something that is actually important to people's working lives. I don't actually think it's sustainable for large numbers of people to work exclusively from home, in part because it sort of is this insidious, colonization of people's home life by the market that I think a lot of people just resist. They're not going to like. They're not going to like the extent to which, and we're already seeing this, right? Like some employers are going to be monitoring your every movement in your home to make sure you're not cheating them. Like we don't have that, but there are certainly people who work office jobs that aren't particularly well paid and do come with a high level of labor control that employers are going to try to replicate in their homes. And I just think that people are going to find that intolerable.
Emily, do you think the 4-day week is realistic, Emily?
I mean, I really want it to be. I'm not sure. I mean, certainly not in every sector. And I think for a lot of white collar workers, I'm thinking now of lawyers, part of the value they offer is that they're constantly available. And the 4-day work week really goes in the opposite direction, unless you're doing work share, which always seems really enticing and then never seems to quite pan out in large numbers. But I'm struck.
Why does it matter that lawyers? I don't think of lawyers as being a profession where you have to always be available. Why do you have to be available?
It's a huge thing in white shoe law firms, like the idea that your clients can find you at any time, that you have. That's what, like, the whole pressure of have a
but that's the opposite of a 4-day week. That's a 7-day week. But you could imagine it's like, oh, I'm basically, if my client calls me, I'm available, but I'm not actually doing anything for that day until he called me.
Well, I guess so. But in law firm culture, the idea that you work all the time is definitely a thing. But I was going to say something in response to Jamelle's point. I mean, I totally get you on the sinister, like, big brother corporate overlord front. On the other hand, I have been surprised by the number of surveys I've seen of particularly white collar workers saying that they are happier in their work from home pandemic conditions, despite like the hell of Zoom school that so many parents are going through. And I think part of it is ending the commute, right? Like one thing about the 4-day work week is you could work longer hours, but do less traveling. And I guess in my ideal hybrid imagination, I mean, hybrid school maybe not to be such a good idea, but I mean, what if you could recreate some of the office culture that, David, you love? And I've loved at various times because you have like staggered times where everyone's in the office. So like the people you work with directly are there twice a week and all the meetings that need to happen among you happen then, but then everybody stays home on Thursday and Friday. Even if you didn't have a full third day a week off, if people were home and there was like a reduced set of expectations about the number of hours, how late they were available, that could make a huge difference. I mean, just like having a work that basically ended at 3:00 on a Friday would be a big deal for a lot of people.
But do you need a structure of a government structure that takes care of a lot of the basic needs of working families in order for this to work. Because if you don't, then everybody will compete and work the 5th day and 6th day and 7th day in order to pay for all the things you need to have in order to go to work. In other words, to pay for the childcare or to, well, mostly to pay for childcare. So in order, because you'll always have that competition by somebody who wants to work more. And sure, some people will do it just to make more money, but other people will make it to survive or to have, basically half decent standard of living. So is it a precondition of the 4-day work week that you have some kind of basic level of services, and then what would those be?
Yeah, and the places that are experimenting with it are like, it's like Germany and Denmark and France and New Zealand, places that are humane are doing that. Yeah. I wonder about the. Go ahead, Jamelle.
No, I was just gonna second that. No, when you look, you mentioned, David, at the beginning that the weekend, the 5-day workday, these things are relatively recent inventions. And if you can actually look at the labor campaigns for the weekend in the late 19th century, and they're all, the case for it is basically, look how prosperous we are. Why can't people just have a couple days to rest? And that's kind of been lost over the last, century. We've gotten more productive. We've gotten richer collectively, but we're still working 5 days a week, 6 days a week, 7 days a week. And it shouldn't really be that much of a challenge to say collectively, we're a rich country. Why do we got to work so much? And well,
it's like it's Marx, right? It's like you'd work in the morning and then you'd hunt and fish in the afternoon. It's his vision of it.
Do you think we psychologically could handle 4 days a week? Are most people like, oh yeah, sure, I can handle, or do people need the order of work, and one extra day would leave them spinning in the street, totally at loose ends?
I think it's find everyone doing shrooms on Friday. Is that your big fear?
I might do shrooms on a Friday, but I think it's worth making a distinction between work in the market for money to pay for things, and then work that people do. That could be anything, right? My dad fixes cars. I do photography and photography work. People have stuff they want to do. They would spend time with their kids. They would take care of parents. They would do stuff. They would work, but it wouldn't be work in the market. We would be working to, subsidize that stuff, but it's not, it's still work. It's still activity. I think people's lives would be just as structured. They would just have time to, handle stuff. You have a day on, if I had a 4-day work week, I would just devote a day to housework. And then I'd have a weekend to kind of do nothing, to, eat shrooms.
I do think well, first of all, you're a columnist for the New York Times.
Glad I introduced that idea. You ran with it.
Yeah. Where do we see Jamelle's next column?
You're a columnist, dude. You write, how many columns a week do you write? 2?
I write 2, and then I do the newsletter.
You have 2 days. You have 2 days of work. That's a 2-day work week.
Oh, come on. Some people report.
Yeah, no,
he's baiting him.
He's baiting him. Don't take it seriously.
But I had to rise to the bait for Jamelle's.
But I do think there's a way in which people are vastly different. This is one of the things I feel like I've learned in the pandemic, is the way people work is really different. And there are people for whom they have to work every day. And if they don't work, they really get incredibly antsy, and it's just how they are wired. And then there are people who
I'm totally unfamiliar with that idea.
Yeah, yes, John Dickerson, you heard.
But everybody doesn't have that same hunted feeling.
I was just reading the beginning of Bird by Anne Lamott, which is a wonderful, and she says that every day of her working life, she has gotten some writing done. She says every day. And I read that sentence 50 times and never identified with it once. Anyway.
Yeah, didn't Trollope wrote every single day. Just he had a word diet every day. He would do it. But,
I think many people would be happy to not do that. And don't do that anyway.
I basically believe that for me, that I think 6 hours of work, sort of 4.5 days a week, is right. That's about the right amount of work. that if you take any 8-hour day that people are working or 9-hour day that people are working, really it's basically like 6 hours of productive work. And you could be as successful. My most successful periods as a writer, I would say I wrote, maybe 3 hours. Like 3 hours of writing in a day is like 16 hours of other work.
Well, yeah. I mean, now we're orienting around our own professions, right? Because like if you're a doctor and you see a lot of patients, or if you're a nurse, or, if you're a sanitation worker, like it's just different. You're knocking off tasks with, you're going through a day's work, and you would change the amount you were doing, presumably. You wouldn't just like pick up the pace, right? I mean, we don't want a world in which working fewer hours means you work super frenetically during those hours.
Right. Can I ask so you have those jobs where they're location specific and those really aren't part of the conversation, and our jobs, we all agree, are idiosyncratic, but for knowledge workers who make up the swath of office parks all across the land, is there and I've talked to some CEOs who've talked about rethinking basically their real estate costs through some of what they've discovered through life in Zoom, and thinking more about hybrid workplaces. Is there a way to build it better? Favorite phrase in this podcast. When people go back to work, in other words, can you take it? But like, for example, in the television realm, people are doing live shots from their living rooms, and the technology is there, and it's basically like 3% worse than if you went to a studio in downtown, wherever you were, and maybe it's 5% better because backgrounds are interesting. They're more relaxed. It's not like the hecticness of some weird studio. So it may actually be better, and it's a whole lot easier, and you can get much better guests and so forth. So there is something that's definitely better out of this, for at least as far as television is concerned. So I'm wondering what the analog to that is in the knowledge work world, or if there is one.
Yeah,
that's a good
teaching
question.
Definitely better in person. I have done 100%. Everything I can to teach in person this semester, and I regret it not 1 ounce. And anyway, I will just throw that in. But there definitely are some things that you could do more over Zoom. I mean, small meetings, like talking to you guys, like anything with like 3 or 4 people up to like 6 people. In some ways, I feel like we finally are at the age of the promised video conference. It could get a little better, but it's pretty good.
I mean, the thing I think about isn't so much with how businesses can do better, but how sort of patterns of living. If people are leaving big cities in some substantial way, and if they're moving to places. The thing about the United States is there are a lot of small to medium-sized cities and towns that still maintain the mid-century infrastructure. So they have a centralized downtown area or main street. They have sort of dense housing in that area. They're sort of built for sort of earlier patterns of living and transportation, and commuting with not commuting long distances but very short ones. And if people are leaving cities and going to those smaller, or New York, LA, Chicago, and going to smaller places, I do wonder how that's going to affect how people think about land use and building and transportation. Emily, I think you mentioned commuting, the fact that people don't like to commute. If people get used to not commuting to work, that might have a real impact on the kinds of choices they make about the places in which they live, right? It may suddenly lead to, I don't want to commute to work. Maybe I don't want to have to drive to go to a grocery store, stuff like that. And so I think when I'm feeling optimistic about all of this, I think that the changing patterns of habitation may end up being the lasting impact from all of this, that people might seek to replicate aspects of urban living in smaller places, which may end up being a good thing across the board. But then I'm thinking about land use all the time like a crazy person, so this is just where my head automatically goes.
What is going on with you and Iglesias and all the smart people are like, oh, it's all land use, everything's land use.
Well, I live in Charlottesville, this like town of 50,000 people. And which means there's something ironically Jeffersonian, but the fact that like my delegate in the House of Delegates lives down the street from me, and I see her like every other day just on the street, or that like I know all the city council people, like I just know all the people on the planning commission, and so it's like I just develop opinions about it.
Well, and also, doesn't Charlottesville have an issue with? I mean, it's got a units problem. I mean, it's got a housing problem.
Yeah, we have a affordable housing crisis is a misnomer because it implies that there's not a housing crisis for people who could pay a little more money, but there is in fact a housing crisis for everyone up and down the scale, unless you are quite affluent and can drop $500,000 for a home.
So, I mean, Jamelle, are you imagining a world in which people truly spread out all over the country and they're not tethered to an office, like they could fly in twice a year? Or are you imagining a world, which is like the world that I live in, where my commute to door is like 2.5 hours at best? So I really don't want to do that more than once a week, but I can go in once a week. I can go in twice a week if I have to. Like, that's a really different length of how long your tether is to your office, right?
Right. I see more the latter, but then I think the thing I see specifically is that people are going to replicate aspects of being in downtown areas where they already live, right? So they may not be going into New York or DC or downtown Philly or downtown Richmond every day, but they do like the fact that it's a short walk from where they're working to getting a cup of coffee.
And then you zone differently so you can actually get a cup of coffee and go to the corner store, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing, over time, a bit there can actually transform a built landscape. And so it's just, I wonder if that's in some places, if that kind of thing is going to happen.
Well, you guys are the pioneers of that, right? Both of you. Like, that's what Charlottesville and living in Charlottesville and working for the New York Times, or living in New Haven and working for the New York Times is, you're saying at the place where people live, they want to live in a small city that has some of those amenities. And then
can you walk to the corner and get a cup of coffee, Jamelle?
The commute and walk to the corner, like Jamelle walks to his coffee shop in Charlottesville, or maybe he doesn't.
I can ride a bike to the coffee shop.
Well, I think it would be a tragedy if a bunch of small cities just stole the thunder of large cities, but we'll leave that for another day.
Wait, seriously? Why?
Yeah. Why? Because I think historically, large cities are centers of gravity that gather talent and culture and creation and innovation, and have an outsized impact on the world around them. And if you disperse that too much, I believe in dispersing it some. I think it would be good if there are 10 cities in the U.S. that were centers of innovation rather than 3. But if you disperse it too much, I think you lose the benefits. I think it will be terrible for the country if people stop gathering in New York City, people stop gathering in Los Angeles and San Francisco and Chicago, because they are now living in the Hudson Valley, or they're living in New Haven. That it's the kind of the massed people together, close together, has an outsized impact on all of us. So that's what I think.
I know you want to move on, but just it's worth saying that that's true, but also in the past it has been more. There've always been the big, New York, LA, Chicago, but there were many more mid-sized cities that played a similar function, right? Like St. Louis at one point played that function in addition to Chicago.
And it was
Cleveland,
regional, right?
Right. It was much more regional in scope. And so you had, Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, a whole host of cities in that regard.
Yes.
Yeah, this is a longer conversation. I don't agree with you at all, but let's save it for another time.
Let's save it. Let's go to Cocktail Chatter. Listeners, viewers want to know what we're each drinking during chatter. Let's start with who should chatter first? Let us say Emily Bazelon. Why don't you chatter first? Are you drinking anything?
I was drinking this weird combination of one of those blackberry ice seltzer drinks and just some regular water. So it's like a funny color.
But not a hard seltzer.
So my chatter is about a kind of amazing, to me at least, essay in the New York Review of Books this week by Janet Malcolm. It's called Second Chances, and it's sort of a coda to the afterword of The Journalist and the Murderer, a book that I read every year because I teach it to my students in the writing class I teach. And the afterword of The Journalist and the Murderer is about Malcolm's experience at that point, the story she wants to tell about being sued for libel and defamation by Geoffrey Masson, who she'd written about. And he claimed that, I think it's a libel and defamation case, maybe it's emotional distress, but in any case, it's this extremely important lawsuit in highfalutin journalism because when he first sued her, he claimed that he hadn't said various things that made him look, in his view, extremely foolish. And at first she couldn't find her notes. Then she finally unearthed them. And so in The Journalist and the Murderer, she's saying basically like, he lost, I won, I found my notes, I was vindicated. In this follow-up essay, it turns out that she has all this regret over how the first of two trials in this case went. She felt that she was made a fool of by Masson's lawyer. And then she got a do-over at the second trial, which she writes about. But along the way, she drops this, to me, crazy revelation, which was that she says she took a whole bunch of things that Masson said at various junctures of her reporting over time, like months, and set them all in one scene in a restaurant, as if he had said them all.
God.
And she calls it like the long scene or something. It has like the long talk, the long quote. It has like, and she claims this is like part of New Yorker culture, that this was a common practice at the magazine, that you would take all these things someone had said and then effectively stage them in one setting. Literally my mouth was open so wide. I couldn't believe this. Completely not allowed in journalism, completely not okay. Like no magazine I've ever worked at, certainly not the New Yorkers, fact checkers would ever abide this and let it go in today's culture. It's crazy.
Well,
but
not
I don't
today's culture. But Joseph Mitchell, like, did you read this? Joseph Mitchell, everything Joseph Mitchell made is a complete confabulation or concoction of random things that happened at different times and made up dialogue. So it's not like they never did it.
Well, it's not like they never did it. So she cites him, and basically he actually made up composite characters. He was this revered New Yorker writer for many years, had all these incredibly endearing characters in New York who he ran into. That's what his book's about. So she cites him as like, oh, that's a bridge too far. I'm not putting myself in the Joseph Mitchell camp, but basically is claiming that this idea of the long quote, the constructed quote in one place, when in fact, like that was a normal thing. And so I was talking to Link Kaplan, who used to write at the New Yorker and teaches this class with me. And I was like, is this true? And he was like, no, like, this is not at all how, he worked at the New Yorker, how he understood it. Anyway, it's just this weirdly, for me, I'm kind of obsessed with this whole discussion of journalistic ethics that Malcolm launches. And she's such a deft writer that she kind of carries you along, even in this new essay. Even though I thought this was nuts, what she was describing, I really also recommend it just because it's a beautiful piece of writing. So anyway, Second Chances, New York Review Books, Janet Malcolm.
So I'm a little nervous that my piece on skateboarding with Jesus and Johnny Cash is not going to make it into the New Yorker now.
You're like so punctilious about journalistic practices, John Dickerson. I'm not really
I have to say, I'm definitely not all the way over with Malcolm, but I do think there's a kind of, I found this actually having been interviewed for a few times in recent years and like for Q&As, and they didn't at all clean up my quotes. And so you have all these run-on sentences. And I just feel like there is you want to convey to readers like something that will be pleasurable for them to read and make sense to them. And often human speech doesn't work that way. And so I think there's some degree of fixing, stitching that it should be permitted that isn't considered a vast breach of ethics. But I defer to you, Emily, because this is your day-to-day job.
Less is more.
John Dickerson, what are you drinking? What's your chatter?
Well, I have 4 different things that I'm drinking.
Are you drinking them simultaneously, or do those represent the different phases of your day?
Some of them are relics from earlier parts of the day, and based on one of the bottoms of this coffee cup, it might be earlier in my this century. The most recent thing I've been drinking is wine. So my cocktail chatter is about the man who killed President Lincoln. It's based on a rabbit hole I went down. Amelia, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name right. Frappoli tweeted about this, and then I went looking, and his name was Thomas Corbett, but came to be known as Boston Corbett, which we'll get to in a minute. He was a hatter, which meant that he soaked rabbit and beaver pelts in mercury. And as everybody here knows from their history and their Lewis Carroll, that this caused hallucinations, psychosis, and also something called Hatter's shakes, which was a twitching. It also encouraged people to follow the Grateful Dead. Anyway, in the early part of his life, things were not good for Corbett. His wife and child died in childbirth. He became a drunk. He then was found on the street by a preacher and convinced to embrace religion, which he did so strongly that he became known as the Glory to God man, because he would burst out into songs and psalms and Bible passages. So he's in Boston. He continues making hats, and this is the problem. Historians think that this led to it. All throughout his life, it's punctuated by moments of going back into the hat-making trade, which historians think basically made him go crazy, although Ambrose Bierce would say that perhaps dedication to religion did. But it was under this influence that in July of 1858, he was propositioned by two what were called at the time prostitutes while walking home from a church meeting. He was really shaken up by this, went home, turned to his Bible, and unfortunately read chapters 18 and 19 of the Gospel of Matthew. And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. And there be eunuchs, which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake.
John, I'm not sure I like where this is going.
Oh, man. I hope he just did the eye. I hope he did the eye, only the eye.
He took this passage literally. He then ate a meal, went to a prayer meeting, and then checked himself into the hospital. In 1861, he joins the Union Army and is constantly shouting out, "Get thee behind me, Satan! Man does not live by bread alone." Bible passages and quotations in the middle of combat, but doesn't get killed. Then calls out his colonel for swearing against God. Gets thrown in the whatever, the clink, I guess you call it, and was to be shot because the colonel was so offended. He breaks out of that, or gets basically let off the hook. He then goes back and joins the cavalry and ends up at Andersonville, the famous Confederate prison, for 5 months. They don't kill him because he is so moved by God that he basically just keeps firing on the Confederate soldiers. They put him in jail. He gets out, rejoins the army. John Wilkes Booth in April of 1865 shoots Lincoln. They surround him 12 days later in Port Royal, Virginia. He won't come out of the barn, so they burn it. Their explicit orders are, do not shoot Booth, take him alive. But Corbett, Boston Corbett, is full of God's fury and says that God told him to shoot Booth. And so he shoots him through the cracks in the barn's wooden siding.
Is he just happen to be there? Like, what's he doing there? Why is he there?
He rejoined the army, and he was part of the posse that went after John Wilkes Booth. This is after basically being kicked out once, rejoining, then being in Andersonville. He then is heralded as one of the great, a newspaper called him one of the world's great Avengers. And he was photographed, and Jamelle, you probably know Matthew Brady, the famous photographer of the era. There is a photograph, and maybe is the photograph up? There he is. Okay, who shot John Wilkes Booth? There he is. This was turned into postcards that were sent around. He went back into hat making. He grew increasingly paranoid, and what happened after the war is half the people in the North thought you deprived us of being able to have a trial of John Wilkes Booth, and in the South, they were angry that he shot him. So he grew increasingly paranoid, and he, to sort of take care of him, the Kansas House of Representatives allowed him to be the doorkeeper. But because of his paranoia, he found himself waving his pistol at anybody who offended him, which was a bad idea when you're trying to make laws. So they put him in an asylum. He broke out of the asylum and went to live the rest of his days in Minnesota, except in Minnesota, he was a part of a hunting party that died in the Great Hinckley Fire, which was one of the greatest disasters at the time in the late 19th century. And so that is the end of the tale of woe of Boston Corbett, who had a very weird life.
You should write a song about him, John, and sing it at the next live Gabfest.
There needs to be a
Jamelle.
movie about this guy. I'm sorry. This is a screenplay waiting to be written.
Yeah,
it's like a Coen Brothers movie. It's a dark comedy.
You don't want to just do a straight up biopic, David? No.
And I left so much stuff out. Oh my gosh, he was quite a guy.
Jamelle, what are you drinking, and what's your chatter?
I drank a glass of mint citrus punch. It's you brew some mint tea, you add a cup of fresh squeezed lemon juice, a cup of fresh squeezed orange juice, a half a cup of honey, and some water, and then you fill half a glass and you add a half glass of citrus seltzer. It's very good. It's from a cookbook called Jubilee, which is a cookbook of African-American cooking, and it's sort of taking an anthropological approach to African-American cooking. The author, Toni Tipton Martin, I think is her name. The author basically has studied...
the editor or something this week.
Yeah, Cook's Country.
Cook's Country, yeah.
That has collected and studied hundreds of recipes and basically narrowed things down that these are representative dishes of Black American cooking, and each recipe in the book is sort of a composite of a lot of different recipes. And there are also historic recipes included in the book as well. I spent like 6 months last year cooking through it. It's a wonderful book. People should check it out. But that's not my chatter.
Oh my God,
that's pretty good though.
Yeah.
My chatter is many people, especially nerds, will know that the second season of Disney's The Mandalorian, which is a Star Wars series, starts next month in October. And while I was watching the preview for it, and there's also a feature about the production of the second season and also the first season that I watched, and I found it really interesting, so I thought I would share. Most people, I think, know what rear projection is, which is in film. Sometimes you cannot actually capture everything you want in camera at the time. And so you film something, you film a chase, cars driving, or you film in Eyes Wide Shut. There's a scene of Tom Cruise walking down a city street. You film someone walking down a city street, and then you project that behind the actor on set. And then you film the projection and the actor, creating the illusion that the actor is there. Any movie made in the 30s, 40s, 50s that has people driving in cars, driving, that was rear projected. It's a technique that's still in wide use. One of the big chase scenes in Terminator 2, I believe, uses rear projection to create its effect. So taking that idea, the producers and creators of The Mandalorian constructed an airport hangar-sized set that is lined with, I'm probably getting this wrong, basically sort of LED screens that they can then create computer-generated backgrounds on the fly, and then the actors are filmed with the computer-generated backgrounds in the back. So the camera is capturing these backgrounds, they're not added in post-processing, which allows you as a director to both, if you need to film a scene on a space planet and a scene on a desert planet, you can do that without going to a different physical location. You can just do it on the same set. But also, it gives the actors a chance. It allows the actors to actually interact with something in their physical environment that they couldn't in traditional, post editing for CG, right? So because they're not actually against the green screen, because the actor actually sees the horizon or they see the mountain, they can act against it. They can react to it. And so, as someone who watched a lot of movies and loves this stuff, I find this super interesting. It's a really ingenious way of doing it, relying on basically a very old technique for film and kind of just updating it. The other cool thing is that animators can change things because they can change things on the fly. If in like a landscape shot with the actors in the foreground, you say to yourself, it would be better if there were a forest in the background. The animators can just add the forest in the background and you can shoot again. So it gives you a lot more flexibility for setting up shots and such. It's very cool.
So, question, is this pandemic inspired? I mean, it seems like it would be helpful in the pandemic because you could control sets more and have like less moving around, or is it just happen to be right now?
I think so. The first season of The Mandalorian aired last year, and I think it's more inspired by just trying to find a way to cut costs. That you want to do this series. It's a television series. It's going to be expensive because you have to do the costumes. You do have to still build some physical sets for things in the midground and the foreground. But you want to cut the cost as low as you can. And you also are, because it's a sci-fi series, you're going to be jumping from location to location in the show. And so, and you're going to be doing a lot of computer animation too. So why not try to find some way to combine all those things, and also, for the sake of the actors and the director and the lighting people and everything, the gaffers, have something that makes things a little more tactile. And this is like this. I find this show interesting on the production level because that's throughout. So one of the key characters in the show is a creature that's of the same race as Yoda. No one actually knows what alien race Yoda belongs to. So it's just Baby Yoda. But on set, when you watch it, it's like obviously a computer animated thing. But on set, it was a puppet, and they used the puppet. You can see that when you watch the show as well. There are scenes where they sort of just like augmenting the puppet with computer animation. But there was a physical puppet that the actors interacted with, which does actually transform how the actors perform. It's very different to perform with a physical thing versus something inserted in after the fact.
My chatter, well, I'm drinking some IPA that I bought today. I don't know what it is, but here's some free product placement. My chatter is something that my youngest child, Gideon, sent to me, which is the Oddly Satisfying YouTube channel. And hopefully we'll show it. Yes, here it is. And it's just a set of videos. It's like ASMR, but it's things being extruded, things being lined up perfectly, things being wrapped speedily, things being folded, being peeled off. It is it's very orderly. Everything like happens and gets finished in the most satisfying way, and it's incredibly relaxing. It's like picking a scab that's just ready to be picked off, and it's just picked off perfectly. I love
I was with you until that, and that.
I know that was close and wrong.
All right, sorry.
You had your visual display.
Well,
it's like taking a ballpoint pen and driving it into your ear.
All right. Well,
perfectly tying your tie or something. I've never done that.
It's extremely relaxing. Check it out. Oddly Satisfying. Listeners, you have also sent us great chatters this week. You tweeted them to us at Slate Gabfest, and this one comes from at Janet Cetera, Janet Green, and she begins it very charmingly. I feel a little too Canadian submitting this as potential chatter, but this CBC interactive story recounting a family's epic canoe trip from Canada to Brazil is great, and it is an amazing story about a father and his two sons, ultimately one son because one gave up the trip, who paddled from the northern reaches of Canada all the way down to Brazil in a canoe, like some river, some ocean going, minimal portages. And they did this 40 years ago, and they were held at gunpoint a bunch of times. They nearly were murdered in Honduras. And it's great. So check it out. It's called Paddle of the Century on the CBC. That is our show for today. The Gabfest is produced by Jocelyn Frank, who is off screen, and our researcher also off screen is Bridget Dunlap, and also off screen is Faith Smith, who arranged this nice live show with our partners at Texas Tribune. Thank you, Texas Tribune. Thank you, Evan Smith over in Texas. Gabriel Roth is the editorial director of Slate Podcast. June Thomas is managing producer. Alicia Montgomery, executive producer. For Emily Bazelon, well, I should say, those of you on the stream, we're going to do some questions for Slate Plus coming right up, but I'm saying this goodbye for the show. For Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson and Jamelle Bouie, I'm David Plotz. Thanks for listening. We will talk to you next week. All right. Hello, Slate Plus. How are you? Our Slate Plus today is we're going to answer some of the questions that you have sent us in this live stream. So I don't know if you guys are looking at these, but all right, Emily, let me throw to you the first one. Can you speak about the Pennsylvania federal court decision re the government's COVID restrictions? Are there similar lawsuits in other states?
Yeah. So Governor Tom Wolf issued the kind of restrictions we've seen in a lot of states. And this is a pretty surprising decision, I would say, given what we normally think of as the breadth of a governor's emergency powers. This decision has to do particularly with the Pennsylvania statute. I don't think it's going to translate necessarily to other states. I also think the ruling will be appealed. And it's coming at a time when we're at least in a kind of lull of how much shutdown we need to be mandating statewide, in some states at least. But of course, this is very much a live issue going forward because we don't know what the future is going to bring and whether governors are going to feel compelled to issue more of these orders over the winter, though, boy, do I hope not.
All right, John or Jamelle, either of you can take this. Questions about Mike Bloomberg. So he says he's going to put $100 million to help in Florida. Is this good for democracy, bad for democracy? And also there's a sort of second question, which is, shouldn't he use some of that money to re-enfranchise a bunch of felons by paying off their fines?
Do you have a strong opinion, Jamelle?
I don't
have... All right, forget the second part of it. But
I can take the second part. Go ahead.
Okay, you can take the second part. That's good. That's a good Bazelon thing. But the first part of it, is $100 million spent by Biden, is that going to help Biden, John?
I don't know. I feel like it's going to make the rubble bounce a little bit. I mean, on the other hand, the average of polls in Florida has the spread at about 1 or 2 points in Florida. So it's quite close. So, even if you make a tiny little bit of a change, then maybe that matters. It all goes to Biden. I guess what I would say is, okay, let's say it doesn't change a lot of minds. It does pin the president down in a state that, as Jamelle mentioned earlier, he really, really needs to win. Joe Biden can get to 270 without winning Florida, Georgia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina. But he does have to win, in that case, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, where he's actually doing well in all those states, and Arizona. So he doesn't need Florida, but the president needs Florida. So if this bogs the president down, if Mike Bloomberg wants Joe Biden to be elected and he bogs the president down in Florida and makes him spend a lot of time and energy and money down there, then that's time, energy, and money that can't be spent in all those other states. So I suppose in that sense, it might, $100 million is $100 million. So it can't, I don't think it can hurt.
That's not the most ringing endorsement I've ever heard in my life.
I really built a tiny little pile out of that argument, but that's all I could do.
Jamelle,
I think you don't have to add anything.
I do think that's right. The first part of the question was whether it's bad for democracy. And I generally think that, like billionaires dropping 9-figure sums in elections is just it's not good.
Yep. Agreed.
I agree with that.
About whether to pay off the fines and fees of the many, many formerly convicted people who were supposed to gain the right to vote through a Florida ballot initiative that passed. So the argument for doing this is that there are around 775,000 people who will not be able to register to vote because of a law passed by the Florida legislature and signed by the governor, but most recently because of a court decision by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. So there's sort of two questions. One is the justice of all these people not being able to vote, especially going against the will of the voters who passed the ballot initiative. And I think that's a serious, deep moral travesty. Then there's a strategic question of, how many of these people would register to vote in time, would vote? Is it a good use of resources right now? How much money do they owe? And one of the really confounding parts of this court decision is that nobody knows the answer to how much money they owe, because the state doesn't even have to make that clear. I mean, sometimes we're talking about debts that people have no idea how much money they owe because they were issued fines years ago. Maybe they paid part of it off. Like, there don't seem to be any kind of good estimates about that. And so if you're just purely thinking about political strategy for November and not these deeper moral questions, I'm not sure how good a short-term investment it is. But I do think this problem of disenfranchising people who were meant to regain the vote is like a serious one.
Is so depressing. What I thought there was going to be a thing, Emily, where certain counties in Florida were just going to clear those debts. Are they not allowed to do that?
They can't clear the debts, but there were some deals worked out with the court system and the prosecutor's offices, for example, in Miami, that they weren't going to prosecute these cases. And I think that has helped to some degree. The number that I just gave, 750,000, is smaller than the number of people who were enfranchised by Amendment 4, but it's not all worked out. Like, there are a lot of people who are disenfranchised by this decision.
Okay, just a couple more. So Bob Flynn has a question that I think is a natural Dickerson question. So is anyone tracking the norms and rules broken by this administration, this president, so that in the next administration, this Bob Flynn says legislation can be introduced to close some of these loopholes, or just that these norms can somehow be restored?
It's a good question. I mean, I think people are tracking them individually. We're going to start tracking them in the newspapers on the front page every day. I think what'll be interesting. I'm trying to think what would be. It also depends who controls which the House and the Senate, and then whether in the excitement of gaining presidential power again, there might be a few of those norms that once you're back in power, you wouldn't mind not kicking in again. It's certainly been the case that presidents who take on new power are reluctant to give it back, even though they campaign perhaps against, nobody wants to limit themselves. So it'd be really interesting. I haven't done that exercise. A lot of it is just in the temperament of, if Joe Biden wins, the norms will be restored simply by his behavior. Lots and lots of norms will be restored and expectations. And I think what would be interesting is to think through which ones shouldn't be restored. Which traditions and norms are vestiges. And I've been trying to get rid of the 100-day measurement mark for my whole career, including when I interviewed the president on his 100th day. So you can see how successful if I can't even convince myself. But some of the norms, I think a lot of the norms will basically come back. Like the norm of, I was thinking about this week, there used to be a norm that you at least had to pretend to strive for bipartisan deals, even if you didn't mean it. Especially if you didn't mean it, right. You had to at least pretend. You had to at least get caught trying. And President Trump hasn't bothered at all. And that has, given him much glory for many of his supporters. But that will certainly return if Joe Biden is president, in part because Mitch McConnell kind of likes him. Which I'm sure Joe Biden doesn't want to say out loud a lot. But read Mitch McConnell on Joe Biden in Mitch McConnell's book. It's very supportive.
Okay, last question on this.
It won't be when he's president, but
right. Last question on this. From Christina Travado. Jamelle, any opinions on which way North Carolina will go? I presume not like in North Carolina will go in football or basketball. I presume in the presidential election.
I think the polls right now show North Carolina to be quite close, with kind of Biden and Trump trading leads. The Senate candidate Cunningham, I think that's his name, is ahead, and usually is ahead of Biden. I think a poll came down today that showed Biden ahead of him, so that's a little unusual. But I would say that right now Biden probably has the edge. I'm going to turn the question to make a comment about something else. So the interesting thing about North Carolina is that its partisan trajectory is basically, let's say 5 to 8 years, 2 cycles behind Virginia's in terms of its kind of shift blue, in part because they share, a bunch of similar demographic qualities, right? There are large metropolitan areas that attract lots of college-educated and knowledge workers. There is a substantial African-American population. There's a growing Hispanic and Asian American population. So it's happening slower, and the 2 states have different political histories. And North Carolina, by virtue of not really having the same coastal economy as Virginia does, Hampton Roads, major anchor of Virginia for its entire history, North Carolina doesn't really have an equivalent. There are a bunch of reasons why North Carolina is moving slower along that path, but they're on the same path. The interesting thing is that South Carolina is on that path too, that there are differences, right? South Carolina does not have the same kind of large metro area, although the Charleston and Columbia metro areas are growing, and the Charlotte metro area goes into the Greenville metro area in South Carolina. But it's also seeing steady in-migration of college-educated whites. It has a larger African-American population than either Virginia or North Carolina, and growing populations of other non-whites, not all of whom are going to vote for Democrats, but whom have a stronger Democratic lean than sort of native-born whites. And so South Carolina happening, if North Carolina is maybe Virginia in 2008, South Carolina might be Virginia in 2000, but it's on the same kind of trajectory. And I think it's interesting. It's not hard to imagine a partisan landscape 15 years from now where the coastal South is reliably Democratic for these demographic reasons, and for these in the Rust Belt, right? I mean, I think that's where you can it's happening in slow motion, but you can kind of see it clearly that Minnesota, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, these places become reliably more Republican voting, and the trade is the Sun Belt in the coastal South. The Deep South is its own thing that has its own strange dynamics, but I don't know. I find that really interesting.
By which you mean Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas,
Louisiana.
Right. In part because it's been historically unusual for the South to have serious partisan competition, right? There's always been a solid South one way or another, and the extent to which the solid South is dying, not necessarily because it's becoming uniformly Democratic or whatever, but because there's genuine partisan competition in southern states, is a novel thing to happen in American political history. And I'm not sure people have really kind of absorb what the implications might be for national politics.
That's so interesting. I didn't know that at all.
That's a great way to finish. All right. Bye, Slate Plus. Catch you next week. Bye, live stream. Bye, everybody. Bye, Texas Tribune. Bye, Facebook. Bye, YouTube. It's been a pleasure being with you. We want to be with you in person soon. It won't be soon. Forget it. Why even bother? At some point.
Okay, that's scary.
I mean, as I was speaking it, I was like, all right, it's not going to be soon. So
Redfield today said end of second quarter, beginning of third quarter is when, widespread distribution of a vaccine. That's 9 months from now.
Yeah. Oh my God.